Good evening. I'm Richard Avermenko, the director of SCETL, which is the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with SCETL, we're a relatively new school on campus with faculty whose research and teaching focus on antiquated ideas like great books, the American founding, American constitutionalism, political and economic thought, national security and statecraft, and the likes. If you look at our website, on our splash page, you'll read the slogan that is supposed to describe what we do. And it says, inspiring a new class of leaders. We're working on changing this, as it's a bit vague, to say the least. After all, Genghis Khan, Lenin, and Mao were all leaders, and I'm sure they had a bunch of the class of leaders as well. But leadership, as we at SCETL understand it, needs content. It needs a guiding star. And to lose your guiding star is literally a disaster, a disastro. And at SCETL, we aspire to offer the content, to offer this star to remedy this disaster. Hence, I've been throwing around a few ideas for our splash page, like in defense of civilization, or in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, or the intellectual heart of the new American university. That one I know is a little hubristic. Or we could repurpose the SCETL acronym to something like strengthening character, elevating thoughtful living. I got that from Grok. Or the one that Sean Beinberg and I really like, strengthening constitutional excellence, teaching liberty. Oh, thank you. That wasn't Grok, that was all me. Whatever we come up with, our intention, our mission includes the fostering and modeling of civil discourse. An essential part of SCETL's operation is our civil discourse project. And there's really no better way to model civil discourse than a good old-fashioned debate. So thank you all for coming out this evening to this good old-fashioned debate. I'm told it's hubristic to call something the first annual, but I really do hope that this is the first iteration of a partnership with the Steamboat Institute. SCETL can't do what they do. We don't live alone. We can't do what we do without the support of donors, many of whom are in the audience here tonight, and without foundations like the Steamboat Institute, to whom we are grateful. And that said, let me both introduce and thank our guests and co-sponsors of tonight's event. Jennifer Schubert-Aitken is Chairman and CEO of the Steamboat Institute, an organization she co-founded in 2008. The Steamboat Institute promotes America's first principles and encourages civil discourse by hosting debates on college campuses across America. Jennifer is a member of the advisory boards for the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado in Boulder and the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at the University of Maryland. She also serves on the board of directors of Rebecca's Angels, which is a nonprofit organization helping children with post-traumatic stress disorder, founded by the Boston Marathon bombing survivor, Rebecca Gregory. And Jennifer can tell us how many times she has run the Boston Marathon. Jennifer, thank you for coming. The conch is yours.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Rick. I really appreciate the warm welcome. We love what you do here with SCETL on the Arizona State campus. And yes, we would love to make this the first annual collaboration between SCETL and Steamboat Institute. So thank you for that. We welcome all of you with us here in Tempe tonight, as well as many more who are watching the live stream all over the country. I would like to give a special shout out to some groups who are hosting watch parties tonight. We have a group at the Independence Institute in Denver, the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at the University of Maryland, and the Generals Redoubt Alumni Group at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. So welcome to all of them and all of the others watching the live stream. If you are, oh, please go ahead. Yes, absolutely. If you're interested in hosting a watch party for any of our upcoming debates, which I'll tell you just a little bit about, please send us an email, info@steamboatinstitute.org, and we'll send you a box of free swag for your watch party to make it fun for your guests. You provide the pizza and beverages, and we'll provide some swag. Very briefly, Steamboat Institute was founded in Steamboat Springs, Colorado in 2008 for the purpose of educating people about America's constitutional principles and fostering an appreciation of the freedom we enjoy as Americans. With inspiration provided by former University of Colorado President Bruce Benson, Steamboat Institute has hosted dozens of debates on college campuses all over America over the past 7 years. Why debates? Well, it's because, as John Stuart Mill, the 19th century English philosopher, famously stated, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." Our goal with every debate is to teach students and all who attend how to think, not what to think. You are always welcome at a Steamboat Institute Campus Liberty Tour debate, regardless of your political ideology. We only ask that you show respect and civility to our speakers and to the other guests. Tonight's debate is the third of 5 debates we are hosting on campuses across America this spring semester, with a unique debate topic at each location. Earlier this semester, we were at Princeton University with a debate on whether the U.S.-Israel alliance is a strategic asset for U.S. foreign policy. Last week, we were at the University of Colorado in Boulder with a debate on whether transgender athletes should be allowed to compete in women's sports. Next week, on April 23rd, we will visit the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where the topic will be birthright citizenship. And finally, on April 29th, we will wrap up our spring debate tour with a visit to Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction on whether more federal agencies, such as the Bureau of Land Management, should be relocated outside of Washington, D.C. All of our debates are live streamed on Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel, and any of the debates from the past you can view on the live stream, on our YouTube channel in their entirety. You can view all of the topics and speakers for the upcoming debates at steamboatinstitute.org. I believe we also had some flyers out here with the debate schedule, so please feel free to check that out and share it with others. One other brief thing before we get into tonight's debate, we have a special opportunity for students and young professionals ages 20 to 29. On August 22nd and 23rd, we will host our 17th annual Steamboat Institute Freedom Conference at the Beaver Creek Resort near Vail, Colorado. We have hundreds of people come from all over the country to meet and mingle with our nation's leaders in government, business, entertainment, education, military, you name it. For these young leaders, we offer scholarships to attend this conference. It covers travel, meals, lodging, their event registration, and most importantly, networking with these leaders who come from all over the country. So scholarship applications are now available at steamboatinstitute.org. We're accepting those through June 13th. It really is a tremendous opportunity. So feel free to look us up around here after the debate tonight. We'll be sticking around to answer your questions. We also have general registration for anyone who would like to attend. You will, I think, have a great time if you join us in Beaver Creek in August. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences all over the country. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Coors Foundation for their generous support, which has allowed us to expand the Campus Liberty Tour debates to more campuses across America. I would also like to thank Bruce and Marcy Benson, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, the Anschutz Foundation, Tina Snyder Foundation, and the Woodford Foundation for Limited Government. Back in 2014, the comedian Dave Smith did a stand-up routine on America's problems, including the national debt. And he also discussed his proposed solutions to these problems. He said, "We have almost $17 trillion in debt in America, And I'm here to tell you the answer to this problem, said Dave Smith. We're not going to pay it. So fast forward to 2025, our national debt is currently $36 trillion. What does this number mean? And what, if anything, should we do about it? What relevance does this have to each of us as U.S. citizens and taxpayers? Tonight's program will examine this issue with a fair and balanced debate on the following resolution. Be it resolved, the U.S. federal government should make reducing the national debt a fiscal priority. We invite all of our audience members to respond with your view on this resolution. So please use your phones. Agree, disagree, or undecided before the debate begins here in just a minute using the QR code provided. You can see that some people have already voted. You can see on the screen what the current audience opinions look like. Those of you watching the live stream, you can vote too. And then when the debate is over, we're going to ask you to vote again to see if opinions have shifted. So please participate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening. So I'm going to ask them to come up to the stage and join us, and then I will briefly introduce each of them, and then we'll get the party started. All right, so I will introduce each of our speakers. They will remain seated, and then we will begin with their opening remarks. Arguing the affirmative on tonight's resolution is Stephen Moore, economist and author, who is also serving as a senior visiting fellow in economics at the Heritage Foundation. He is a frequent lecturer to audiences around the world on the U.S. economic and political outlook, and is the author of 6 books, including Trumponomics, Inside the America First Plan to Revive Our Economy. From 1999 to 2004, Steve served as founder and president of the Club for Growth, an organization dedicated to helping elect free market candidates to Congress. In his tenure as president, the Club for Growth became one of the most influential and respected political organizations in the nation. From 2005 to 2014, Steve served as the senior economics writer for the Wall Street Journal editorial page and as a member of their editorial board. He remains a regular contributor to the journal. Moore also served as a senior economic advisor to President Trump's 2016 campaign, drafting tax, budget, and energy policy plans. His book, Return to Prosperity: How America Can Regain Its Economic Superpower Status, was a finalist for the F.A. Hayek Award for Advancing Economic Understanding. In 2018, Worth Magazine named Steve Moore one of the 75 most influential people in the world dealing with economics and finance. Steve is a graduate of the University of Illinois and holds a master's degree in economics from George Mason University. Let's give a warm welcome to Steve Moore. Arguing the negative on tonight's resolution is Stephanie Kelton, best-selling author of The Deficit Myth and an economist with a fundamentally different perspective on inflation, government debt and deficits, and economic policy overall. Bloomberg's Tom Keene has credited Stephanie Kelton with having, quote, a greater influence on the debate of our American economics than anyone out there. Stephanie's paradigm-shifting analysis can be found in Bloomberg Opinion, the Financial Times, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, U.S. News and World Report, and CNN, as well as on national radio and TV programs. She delivers economic analysis, research, and commentary using a modern monetary theory framework to over 16,000 subscribers through her Substack, The Lens. She is also a key subject matter expert in Finding the Money, a 2023 documentary on modern monetary theory. Stephanie is a former chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee Democratic staff and has been named one of Politico's 50 most influential thinkers, Barron's 100 most influential women in finance, Prospect's top 50 thinkers, and one of the Bloomberg 50. Please give a warm welcome to Stephanie Kelton. Our moderator for this evening's debate is Carrie Sheffield. Carrie is a columnist and broadcaster in Washington, D.C., and is a senior policy analyst at Independent Women's Forum. Carrie earned a master's in public policy from Harvard, concentrating in business policy. She also earned a BA with honors in communications at Brigham Young University and completed a Fulbright Fellowship in Berlin. Carrie managed municipal credit risk at Goldman Sachs and served as lead analyst on a $5 billion portfolio of healthcare bonds at Moody's Ratings. Carrie has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, CNN Opinion, the New York Times, Washington Post, and many others. She's a frequent guest on major media networks, including Fox News, Newsmax, MSNBC, CNN, and several others. Let's give a warm welcome to Carrie, and now I'm going to turn it over to England.
Welcome. We're on now. All right, everybody, we're excited. So we're going to have opening statements, both of our, not candidates, our speakers here. I like to think here, candidates here for thought leadership. So Steve, we're going to give you 5 minutes, and then Stephanie gets 5 minutes, and then we're going to have an open-ended Q&A where I will ask some questions that I've prepared, and then you all will get involved. You should be able to access through your QR code to ask questions. And I have those questions on this trusty iPad, and I will sort through and feed as many questions as I can to our two speakers. And then at the end, we'll take another poll and see where folks stand and see which one of these speakers was most persuasive. So with that, we'll let Steve start things off for 5 minutes.
Do you want me to go to the
Sure,
stage?
if you'd like to.
Okay.
Whatever you prefer. But make sure you take your mic, Steve. Steve.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure and privilege to do one of these Steamboat debates. Jennifer, you've done an amazing job with Steamboat, and I think I was there when you started this whole thing 20 years ago, and its growth has been fantastic. Honored to be with the great Senator John Kyle from Arizona, one of the best senators we've had in 25 years. So, John, thank you for being here. And it's also an honor to get to do this debate with Stephanie. You know, you were in the top 50 list of Bloomberg and others. I was 71st on the Worth magazine of financial experts in the world. And when somebody called me and said, "You made this list," and I saw that, I did. And then I looked at the list, and I was 71st, and Warren Buffett was 74th. You know, I think there's something wrong with that list. Anyway, look, I have been in Washington now for 40 years. I arrived in 1984. I think, were you there, Senator, in 84? Okay, so I was there even before you were. And there have been big changes in the last 40 years in Washington. And just to give you a sense of what has happened to our debt and deficit, when I came to Washington, I had the honor of working at the budget office under Ronald Reagan. We did something we weren't very proud of. For the first time in American history, in 1985, we introduced the first $1 trillion budget in American history. And that was, oh my God, $1 trillion. That just seemed an unfathomably large number. And at that time, by the way, in addition to the $1 trillion budget, at that time, our entire national debt, all of the money that we had borrowed from the Revolutionary War, through the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, that over that whole 200-year period was $1 trillion. So compare that with where we are today. It's kind of daunting, isn't it? So we don't have a $1 trillion budget today. We have a $7 trillion budget. I think that's obscene. I think that amount of money is outrageous. I think that one of the great things about what Elon Musk is doing is exposing to us all, whether you like Elon Musk or not, whether you believe in big government or not, everyone should be outraged by the incredible fraud and abuse that's happening widespread throughout our government. It is thievery what's happened. The fraudsters that have taken money out of the unemployment program, the Medicaid program, the Medicare program, and nobody in Washington has done anything about it. There's $145 billion that was stolen from the Medicaid program that went to fraudsters that were not eligible for the program. And a lot of people in Washington don't want to do anything about that. So there's no question in my mind, if you just look at the stuff that Elon Musk is talking about. By the way, Pentagon is a huge bureaucracy where we could save hundreds. And I'm a strong on defense guy, as you are, Senator Kyle, but I think we could save a lot of money there as well. So we can do this. But the main point I want to make is the question is should it be a priority that we reduce the deficit? I think everybody thinks that, right? I mean, everybody knows that we can't keep doing what we're doing right now. It's dangerous. It's really, really dangerous to continue to borrow $2 trillion a year, especially at a time when the, sorry, that was Janet Yellen. Sorry, no. So we can't do this. We have to reduce our deficit. It is irresponsible and it's unfair to our children and grandchildren and future generations of Americans. But the one thing that I want to, the main point I want to make just in this opening statement is this, that there's something a lot more important than reducing the deficit, and that is growing the economy, creating the most prosperous economy we possibly can, creating jobs, creating a better stock market, creating better opportunities for Americans. And I'm here to tell you that if we can do this, we can reduce the burden of our debt. And I think if you go away from this debate with nothing else, understand this. If we don't grow the economy faster, we are not going to bring the debt down. It's just mathematically impossible. We have to grow the economy more. Now, the good news is that if we do grow the economy by doing all sorts of things, let's go to a flat tax, let's move to 401k plans for Social Security, so every American can actually save their money. Let's have universal vouchers, so every school child can have a great education. All these things we know we need to do. And so if you look at this chart, this is just the latest number from the Congressional Budget Office, their official scores in Washington. And you can see that red line is the thing that we're all afraid of. That's showing you what's going to happen to the debt if we stay on the path that we're on right now. This will just take 30 more seconds. And so you can see that path goes up and up and up and up to a very, very dangerous level. Eventually it hits 200% of GDP, which would be catastrophic because all we'd be doing is working to pay interest on our debt. But there is a way out of this crisis, and that is to grow the economy faster. So what this chart is showing you is that the standard forecast is 1.7% growth per year. Hell no, we're not going to grow at 1.7%. We're going to grow a lot faster than that if we do the right things in our society. We can grow. The average growth rate of the U.S. economy over the last 100 years has been 3.2%. So what I did is just put 3%. We're going to make it a national goal that we grow the economy at 3% per year.
All right, Steve, you're gonna pick it up after that.
So I'm just this is the last point, and then I'll stop. So if you grow the economy at 3% per year, the debt goes down, 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 down. That's what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, and now Stephanie will.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you. The clicker. I'm going to use the clicker. The clock is not ticking yet. I don't have the clicker going. I'm not afraid of the red line. I'm not afraid of the red line. And so I hope the clicker is going to work. Is the clicker going to work? Oh, there we go. The usual debate over the national debt would involve a Democrat and a Republican standing up and both saying, what a problem we have in front of us, and then pointing the finger at one another and saying, and it's your fault. You did all the tax cuts that left us without the revenue we need. And the other one would say, no, it's your spending that got us into this trouble. It's because of Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid. That's not the debate I came here to have tonight. I don't have to blame something on the national debt because I don't think the national debt is the problem Stephen believes that it is. Okay, so I want to have a very different kind of conversation, and I want to start that conversation by talking to you about how the government actually spends. Are you ready? Congress decides to spend money. They pass a budget or a piece of legislation. It sends a set of instructions to the government's bank, the Federal Reserve. Congress is saying, here you go, Fed. We have decided to spend this money. Your job is to carry out the payments that have been authorized by Congress on behalf of the U.S. Treasury. How does the Fed carry out the payments? It uses a computer keyboard. It changes the numbers in the appropriate bank accounts by making the number go up. Okay, that's what happens. And at the end of the day, the person who receives the payments has more money in their account, And that person's bank has more money in their account called the reserve account at the central bank. Can the government spend too much? Sure. Congress can authorize payments of any size it chooses. If the votes are there, the money is there. There is no financial limit, but there is an inflation limit. And that's the thing you have to watch out for. Okay, who's familiar with that image on the right? Everybody's seen one of those. Everybody's got one of those. That is your frequent flyer mile account. It might be with Southwest or Delta or United. You get credits in your account when you take flights, when you spend money on your credit card and so forth. Somebody puts miles in your account, right? Where do they come from? Well, they come from a computer keyboard at Delta or wherever. And so you're accumulating these miles. And at some point you decide to do something. You want to take a trip. So you tell Delta, I'm going to use 60,000 miles. I'm going to go on a vacation. And what does Delta do? They debit your account. You're redeeming your miles. Same thing happens when you pay taxes to the federal government. You've accumulated some dollars, and now it's time to pay some back. So you write a check to the IRS. Your check is giving instructions to your bank. Debit my account. I'm paying $5,000 in federal taxes. What happens? Your account is debited, the balance goes down. Keep in mind that the system needs to have the credits before anybody can use them to make payments, okay? So here's a graph from a Congressional Budget Office report. It shows you exactly how it works in the real world. The government in this case spent about $6.3 trillion into our hands on all those different programs you see up there. And then they taxed away from us about $4.4 trillion. If they're crediting and debiting accounts and they're adding more than they're subtracting, what do the rest of us get left with? A surplus of about $1.9 trillion. We call it a deficit because we're only looking at it from the perspective of the government's budget. But if we look at it from the perspective of the non-government part of the economy, that's our financial surplus to the penny. Okay, where did it come from? It came from the fact that the government is doing that bleeding of red ink that everybody worries about. Oh my God, why are they mismanaging their finances? Why can't they get it together and balance the budget? That sea of red ink is so troubling. Is it? Is it really? Flip it around. If you flip it around, what do you see? You see the financial, you see, I was told to be careful where I walk. You see the financial surplus that is accumulating in the private sector. This is the private sector. This is where we all live. These are the households and the businesses in the US economy. And they're in surplus because of the government's deficits. If you put the whole picture together and you bring in the rest of the world and this is real data, okay, I didn't make this up. The government deficit is what is allowing the rest of the economy to achieve a surplus. Those deficits are important because they keep the system afloat by providing those credits to our accounts. So once the government adds the credits, what then? What can happen to them once the funds are put in the system? Well, they're either going to stay in the system in bank accounts where we hold them and our banks hold them and the Fed pays some interest on the reserve balances, or they're going to allow us to trade in some of those dollars for a different kind of dollar, one that pays interest, treasury bills, notes, and bonds, government securities that we have weirdly labeled the national debt. It's just a savings account. It's just another way to hold on to our dollars, different ways to hold our surplus. Paying down the debt is dangerous. Paying down the debt means turning on the vacuum cleaner and hoovering those dollars off of our balance sheets and shrinking our financial wealth. Why on earth would anyone want to prioritize shrinking the financial surplus of the non-government part of the economy? Vote no on that.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Great. So now I'm going to ask you both some questions and feel free to respond open-ended if you guys get a really juicy moment. So first, Steve, I'd like you to respond to what Stephanie said about this idea of flipping it over and saying it's not a deficit, it's actually a surplus, because it's a more diffuse benefit to households. It's a more diffuse societal wide benefit versus a deficit to a more smaller group, which is the government.
Well, I would sort of say this, that we sort of had an experiment in this philosophy over the last 4 years. Joe Biden essentially exercised this philosophy that we could just continue to borrow and borrow and borrow, and that it wouldn't harm the economy. And can you put up that chart that I have that shows what happened? Because I mean, look, you all know what happened. We had runaway inflation as a result of massive over government spending and borrowing. I mean, we just all know that's what happened. We had the highest rate of inflation. When Trump left office, the inflation rate was less than 2%. It was at 1.5%. And 18 months later, after spending over $2 trillion, keep going down. I think it's, can you put down? I don't have the clicker.
Oh.
Yeah, here it is. So this just shows you, that what happened with this massive spending spree that was paid for by debt is that, there's an old saying, inflation is just too many dollars chasing too few goods. And what we did was we essentially spent all of this money. The Fed accommodated that spending by printing more and more money. And the victims of this were the American people. And by the way, inflation is the most regressive tax of all. It harms the lowest income people the most. If the price of milk doubles, it doesn't bother Warren Buffett much at all. Or if the price of groceries or the price of rent or the price of insurance goes up, that doesn't affect millionaires and billionaires, but it puts incredible strain on low-income households. And you can see what happened. I mean, everything went way, way, way up in price. And Americans were furious about that. It's the reason every poll shows, why did Joe Biden and Kamala Harris lose the election in 2024? Because people hate inflation. They hate paying more. And I think there's no question that this was a direct result of the overspending and overborrowing in Washington.
Stephanie, I'll give you a chance to respond because you did mention inflation as a constraint.
Yeah, because it's the most important constraint on federal spending. So look, I'm not giving you a philosophy. Nothing I said has anything to do with a belief system. What I did was explain the mechanics of the monetary system we have and how government finance works. I also showed a graph that shows that the government has had its budget in deficit virtually my entire lifetime. Okay, I showed you 50 years of deficits. So it isn't the case that deficits produce inflation. If deficits produced inflation, we would have had high inflation for the last 40 years. But we didn't. We didn't get high inflation until COVID came along and broke supply chains. And we had lockdowns and we had services weren't available. You couldn't spend your money at a nail salon, a theater, a restaurant, a coffee shop. And so everybody was told stay home, and people stayed home and tried to cram what spending they were able to do through the pipeline of goods. Goods have to be produced, they have to be manufactured, they have to be shipped. And we all remember what it looked like when the boats were floating around at the ports and they couldn't unload because the supply chains were broken. And we got inflationary pressure. Then we had a war between the Ukraine and Russia, and we had energy prices go up, and we had food prices go up. And it was kind of like supply shock after supply shock after supply shock. Did the federal spending contribute at the margin to the inflationary pressure? Yes, it did, at the margin. But if you look at studies, whether it's from the San Francisco Fed, the New York Fed, Moody's Analytics, Goldman Sachs, or anybody else who's done an autopsy, a look back, where did the inflation come from that we all just lived through? And no, people didn't like it. Absolutely true. Inflation was a global phenomenon. It happened everywhere in the world. It happened in countries that did far less fiscal policy support than we did. They got worse inflation. So it wasn't the fiscal support. Yes, it contributed at the margin, but everybody who's looked at this with a dispassionate lens and said, where did the inflation come from? Number one, an overwhelming contributor was COVID itself and the supply chains that broke.
So that's not exactly what happened, in my opinion. So look, COVID began in February, March of 2020. The entire economy shut down. I think we can all agree the greatest mistake we ever made as a country in the last 50 years was shutting down our economy, but we did it. And it was a catastrophe for our country. Talk about the supply chains being disrupted. For almost 6 months, the entire American economy was shut down. And yet, and by the way, by around July or August of 2020, we had a boom. Actually, as soon as we reopened the economy boomed. In fact, the last 6 months of the Trump administration, the economy grew 11% after that huge descent. Now, here's what's interesting about that. If this were a supply chain problem, and certainly the supply chain problem did contribute to the higher inflation. Why? When Trump left office in January of 2021, the inflation rate was 1.4%. Despite all the supply chain problems. It wasn't until Biden came in and passed, remember, the Build Back Better bill, these trillions and trillions of dollars of spending bills. And by the way, there was a piece that was signed by like 11 Nobel Prize economists. I got honest truth. You can look this up in the New York Times. And these are Nobel Prize winners that are supposed to be the smartest economists in the world. And they said, don't worry, Biden's spending spree will not cause inflation. 12 months later, the inflation rate went from 1.4 to 9.2%. By the way, don't you think all those economists should just give up their PhDs and say, we don't know what we're talking about? I mean, it's ludicrous. And so why was there not inflation when Trump was president? Why was it only when Biden came in and spent and borrowed? And by the way, I'm not blaming all the spending on Democrats. Republicans love to spend money too. But it's very clear, if you spend money you don't have, and especially if you spend it on unproductive things. Look, I'm not against running deficits if it's to spend money on things that are productive for our time. I mean, in the Reagan years, we ran pretty big deficits, right, Senator? But what did we spend the money for? Well, we built up our military and won the Cold War. What is the discounted present value of that? Trillions and trillions of dollars. And we rebuilt our economy with the Reagan tax cuts. That's a pretty good return on the money. Under Biden, all we did was spend money on windmills, solar panels. We spent money on, unemployment insurance programs, things that don't add to the productive use of the economy. And that's, I guess, my point. If you're spending money on things that don't help grow the economy, paying people not to work is not a very good way to grow the economy.
Well, I would imagine that Stephanie would argue that the things that she puts in her book help grow the economy as well, but I'll give her a chance to respond. And then I got a question for Stephanie.
Well, look, I mean, economists broadly agree. If you want to grow the economy, you make investments in things like infrastructure, education, R&D. These are the most important drivers of economic growth. I want to just step back for a second, though, and address, because this inflation stuff is really important. What happened at the end of 2020 after the lockdowns, right? We finally got a vaccine. The first shot in the arm goes in December of 2020. And you start to gradually reopen the economy and people are getting vaccinated. And then we heard this term revenge spending. What was that about? That was about the fact that people had withdrawn. They pulled back a lot of spending in 2020 because you couldn't do very much in 2020. And by 2021, yeah, people had money in their bank accounts and they were raring to go. They were ready to get back on an airplane, take a trip, go shopping and do all the other things. So we unleashed a lot of spending at one time. And then, of course, the wars and everything else. So, of course, we had inflationary pressure. It isn't the case that it was the fiscal support. It was the case that the fiscal support against the backdrop of a supply-constrained economy, you have a collision of those things and you get a one-time increase in prices that then took a little bit of time to work itself out. We had to deal with war and all kinds of other things as well. I mean, there are all sorts of things I think that Stephen and I would agree on if we were talking about spending. I'll just say, last point, in December of 2020, President Trump signed the last big package. It was a $900 billion package, and it included the second stimulus check. It was a $600 check. And you might remember that the President Trump was very unhappy over the $600 check. Yeah. He was mad, in fact, over that check. Why was he mad? Because he wanted it to be $2,000 for an individual and $4,000 for a couple. Yeah. He wanted $2,000 and he couldn't get it. He only got $600. It was Biden 3 months later who came in with the $1,400 check. And when you add 14 to 6, you get the $2,000 check.
Touche. It's a good point. And we should have never done that. That's my point. What Trump did, and I was totally opposed to it. I don't know about you. I mean, I was completely opposed to this. You don't stimulate the economy by just pumping money into the economy. That just doesn't work. And so you're right. That was also a big contributor. So
how is it different? How is putting money into people's hands via a check? This is Milton Friedman's helicopter drop.
Yes.
How is it different if you put money into people's hands via a check versus leaving money into people's hands by a tax cut. It has the same impact on their bank account.
This is a really important point, actually. The tax cuts that I want to do incentivize people to work. Look, if you tax something, you get less of it. This is a universal truth. And if you tax something more, if you tax something less, you get more of it. If you tax something more, you get less of it. So I want to reduce the tax on work. So we should reduce the payroll tax, for example. I want to reduce the tax on capital investment. We should cut the capital gains tax. That will, if you do that, you will get more investment. You will get more people working. You'll get more money flowing into the United States. And by the way, you don't have to take my word for it. We know that. It happened after the Trump tax cut. It happened after the Reagan tax cut. It happened after the Kennedy tax cut. It happened after one of the great presidents of all time, Calvin Coolidge tax cuts. I don't know if you were there, Senator, for that. But I mean, every time we have cut tax rates, there's a big difference between cutting taxes, just giving people money, and cutting tax rates to incentivize people to create businesses, to invest, to save, and to work.
I think we could find a lot of common ground. I'm not allergic to tax cuts. I think tax cuts can be a perfectly good way to create conditions that promote investments, the kind that we want to see, more participation in the labor market and all sorts of things. I think we might structure them differently, but I'm certainly not here as an opponent of tax cuts per se.
Okay, we agree on tax cuts. Stephanie, I want to ask you for a quote from your book. If you guys want to learn more about her work, her book is called The Deficit Myth. And one of the things you say is,
See that?
it's the deficit myth.
Did this just come out, or you've written so many books?
Do with Mark,
It's a New York Times bestseller.
June of 2020.
Oh.
June of 2020.
With a new forward post-COVID. But a quote from the book says that MMT, which is the acronym for Modern Monetary Theory. So if you're interested in MMT or just want to learn more about it, the book really explains it in everyday language. So MMT teaches us that unemployment is always a policy choice. We can afford to build an economy that guarantees good jobs for all. We live in a democracy. And so my question for that, around that is, but what about the many people who are choosing not to work? We've seen a steep decline in labor force participation, especially among men over the past several decades. And so isn't that a personal choice by them versus a policy choice? Especially when you're having unemployment being so low at only 4.1% or so, and many job openings, and then having those individuals, a lot of them are living on public assistance, which would increase the deficit.
Okay, it's a great question. So what economists and policymakers worry about are the involuntarily unemployed. We don't worry about people who are voluntarily unemployed. If there are students in the room and you're not working because you're a student full-time, we're not counting you as unemployed, and we don't try to create macroeconomic policy to create jobs for you. If you're a senior and you're retired, you're voluntarily unemployed. If you had a program like the kind I talk about in the book, which is essentially, let's imagine that there's a public option in the labor market, that anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work, but can't find a job anywhere else in the economy, if there were a job available at some fixed basic wage, maybe a benefit package, however you want to structure that, then it would act as a very powerful automatic stabilizer. People who are unemployed involuntarily could enter this program, take a job, be paid for doing something useful in their communities, and there's a lot I write about that in the book, produce something useful, earn a wage, and then as the economy strengthens, employers can reach into this pool of employed workers and hire from that pool because it's a better price anchor. It's a better way to stabilize inflationary pressure than letting millions of people, like in COVID, become unemployed. They go on public assistance. If they stay unemployed long enough, their skills atrophy, their work habits fall off, and the employers in our society, in our economy, don't want to hire the unemployed. They're like damaged goods. So what do? They reach around the unemployed and they pick off somebody from their competitor at a higher wage. And this is where some of the inflationary pressure comes from. So what I lay out in the book is a program that would have allowed the government, let's say during COVID, to instead of pulling out the money bazooka and showering everybody with money, to have a much more targeted response. Those monies could have gone directly to the people who lost jobs. They could have transitioned into new employment, been provided with an income, and as the economy recovered, they transitioned back to the private sector.
No, I don't disagree with that, actually. I think that's a good idea. But here's the problem. We have, we just did a study about a year or two ago. In many states, you can get, if you get the full panoply of all the government benefits for not working, a family of four can earn 60, 70, in some cases like states like Massachusetts, $80,000 a year, and no one in the household is working because they're getting, unemployment insurance, food stamps, free healthcare, da, 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 da. And the problem you're going to run into, Stephanie, with that approach is even if you offer somebody a $60,000 job, they'd actually lose money to do that. Now, one of the things that I think we should hopefully all agree on is, and there's been resistance to this, and I don't understand why, that, look, we're a rich country. We don't want people to go hungry. We don't want people to go homeless. We can afford to provide everyone with a safety net, no question about that. But if you're going to take money from the taxpayer, you got to give something in return. You've got to work. And so all we've been saying is, okay, you're going to get these benefits, but if you're able-bodied, I'm not talking about disabled people or people who, for one reason or another, can't work. But if you're able-bodied and you can work and you want these benefits, you have to work. And what's wrong with that?
Look, let's put this program in place and then see what happens. Most people don't want the indignity and the embarrassment, the humiliation of being on food assistance, of being on housing assistance, of being on a variety of government programs where they have to apply and reapply and struggle and fight and argue to stay on benefits. Let's have a program like this in place that allows somebody to have a job and a stable income. And once you no longer qualify for a whole range of benefits because you've got full-time employment and a decent wage that keeps you out of poverty, you're naturally not going to qualify for all of those other programs, and you're going to end up spending a whole lot less. Let's put it in place and see what happens.
All right. Stephen, I want to ask you a follow-up to your chart on the growth, because there is a dispute among some economists around what's called dynamic scoring when you're talking about tax cuts and whether or not the projection should include the growth that economists, some say, would come as a result of the tax cuts, which your chart essentially says. So in essence, aren't you and Stephanie in some ways arguing the same thing, depending on who's crunching the numbers, that you're in support of tax cuts, even if they create lower deficits based on some analysis, because according to dynamic scoring, which is a different analysis, but so there's disagreement on the tea leaves of deficit financing, but in essence, don't you support deficit financing if it lowers taxes?
Here's a way to think about this, and I wonder how you think about this. So when you borrow money, you borrow at an interest rate, right? So right now we're borrowing what, at 4.5% on a 10-year treasury. So if you borrow, if the federal government borrows for something that gives you more than a 4.5% return, do it, right? Borrow for that because you're going to get a higher return. In other words, if you went to the bank and you took out a loan for 4.5%, and you use that money to get 6% return, you'd borrow every single penny you could, right? Because you'd be getting a higher return. So what really matters, and this is where maybe you and I agree more than we disagree, it really depends on what the money is being spent for. So if we can, let's say, reduce our capital gains tax, which I think would be hugely beneficial to the economy, it would lead to more capital investment. It may cause some revenue reduction. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. What I'm saying is that the return from that would be high enough that we would become net positive. So to make it very simple, what I'm saying is anything that grows that economy and gets that growth rate up, even 1.7% is pathetic. It's pathetic. We need to get it up 1.8, 1.92, 2. If we do those kinds of things, and we could probably, Steph and I could probably sit here and find things that we'd agree on that we could do that would get us there, then I'm not so concerned about the financing costs. But I'll just make one other quick point and then shift it over to Stephanie. The one thing we haven't talked about is the interest costs of the debt. And today, I think everyone in this room knows it, that we're paying $1 trillion a year just on interest costs. That is money that doesn't educate kids. It doesn't build infrastructure. Da, da, da. It's just net money down the drain. And one of the things that really scares me about that number, Stephanie, is that we're very, very vulnerable to an interest rate shock. So if interest rates shoot up by another 2 percentage points, which could easily happen, then all we're doing is paying taxes to pay the interest on the debt.
Sure, I'd love to hear responses.
There's a lot there.
And everything else. But
There's a lot there. Boy, it's in my closing set of slides. The answers to these are in the closing set of slides. But look, by the time the bonds are sold, the spending has already taken place. You had to credit the accounts before you can debit them. And so this question I had in the previous slide, I said, if the government is running a deficit, it's making a financial contribution. It's putting the money into the system. And then at that point, you have two options. You can just leave the funds in the financial system. They will sit in accounts at the Fed called reserve accounts, and the Federal Reserve will choose whether and how much interest to pay on those reserves. For a long period of time, almost a decade, the Federal Reserve chose to pay 0 on those reserves. And then the Fed started raising interest rates. And all of a sudden it's paying.
Hold on, you're saying, just so I understand, you're talking about the interest rate on the reserves,
which has budget.
Which was a mistake.
Well,
I think, but.
Well, let's go back to 0.
Yeah.
There you go. We agree. We go back to 0. The whole debate over interest is, look,
I'm not so sure how that justifies deficits. But.
There are two options. Either the funds stay in the system and the Fed pays the interest. Maybe it's 0. Maybe it's something above 0. Today, they're paying between 4.25% and 4.5%. Or you drain the reserves out and replace them with Treasury securities. And then the Treasury pays the interest. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. One is a Fed liability paying interest, and the other is a Treasury liability paying interest. There's no difference, Stephen.
Well, here's the thing, though. There's a mythology that the Federal Reserve controls interest rates. It doesn't. The marketplace controls interest rates. So I'll give you a perfect example. In 2024, the past year, the Fed cut interest rates 3 times. They reduced about 50 basis points on 25, and I think a number of 25, somewhere around there. I don't remember exactly, but it was about a 100 basis point reduction in the short-term interest rates. What do you think happened to long-term interest rates? They went up. They went up. Mortgage rates went up. The 10-year Treasury went up. The Federal Reserve Board doesn't have any control over the long-term rates, and those are the ones that matter. Now, here's a question. Why, when the Fed was lowering short-term rates, did long-term rates go up? And the answer is pretty obvious. What drives long-term interest rates is inflationary expectations. As soon as the Fed started pumping more money into the economy by lowering those rates, investors saw that this was going to, more money in the economy is going to cause more inflation. And so it's almost like the Fed is pushing on a string. They can't control the long-term interest rates. In my opinion, all the Fed should be doing is trying to keep the inflation rate stable and not trying to engineer the economy.
Yeah, the long-term rate is market participants absorbing information and trying to predict the Fed's reaction function. And there's been a long and ongoing debate about whether we get 3 rate cuts, 2 rate cuts, 1 rate cut, no rate cuts, a rate hike. And so this is what the market is doing. It's processing information and it's trying to make a forward-looking guess about what the Fed's reaction function is. Sometimes the two depart. When Alan Greenspan was chair and Greenspan started raising interest rates sharply, he was very frustrated because the 10-year wouldn't go up. It stayed very low. Why?
Well, because we had a non-inflationary environment back then. Greenspan was running the great Fed chairman.
Actually, when Bill Clinton was running budget surpluses, inflation was accelerating through that entire 4-year period. We got inflation to 3.5%. It was increasing.
It was still pretty low
as the budget was getting bigger and bigger into surplus.
So going back to the book on modern monetary theory, because that's, I think, the crux of the major difference between you both on the deficit. And Stephanie, you write in your book when you first studied MMT that you felt great resistance, and you even used the word outlandish when you first had heard about it. Just for the audience, walk them through what was the most outlandish part of it for you, and then walk them through what was the biggest moment of breakthrough that changed your mind on MMT, and then I'll let Steve respond.
Okay. So I was a graduate student. I was studying economics at Cambridge University, and I encountered the work of this guy named Warren Mosler. Warren Mosler comes from Wall Street. He's an investor. He traded in fixed income, and that's where he made his fortune. So he's a Wall Street financial markets guy. And Warren had written this little book called Soft Currency Economics. And at some point in my graduate training, I stumbled on this and I read this and my head exploded, right? Because Warren was saying things that were completely in contrast to everything I'd been taught as a student studying economics. And the thing that really, you said, what was it that really hit it? It was the sequencing. It was when Warren said, the government has to spend first before anybody can have the funds to pay taxes or buy government bonds. The spending has to come first. I had always been taught that the government first collects tax or borrows money, and then it has the money, and now it's in a position to spend. Warren said that's backwards. It has to be backwards. You've all played the game Monopoly, the board game Monopoly. Yes, everybody in this room has played that god-awful game. The first thing you do, what is the first thing you do when you pull out that board game? It's the first thing you do.
You get money.
Get your cash.
The first thing you do is fight over who gets to be the dog and who gets to be the hat. And the second thing you do is somebody has to pass out the money. You can't start the game until you first distribute funds to all of the players, okay? So this is Warren's point. The government is the monopoly issuer of the currency. It has to make the contribution before any of the rest of us can operate with those funds. And Warren said this, and I thought, well, this has to be wrong. Like, it must be wrong. I don't know why it's wrong, but I'm going to find out why it's wrong. So I started doing research and I got deeply involved in the Treasury and the Fed's operations, and I started making phone calls and I started working through it. I wrote an academic article. It was my first peer-reviewed journal article. And that's how I convinced myself that Warren was right. I went through it all and I figured that there was actually no other way for it to work. And if you go through all the balance sheets and you do the operations correctly, you'll find out that that's how it works.
So the problem is that if we look across the world, and we look over the last 75 or 100 years, a new study literally just came out a couple of weeks ago on this, and you look at how much government spend and borrow, and you look at their economic growth rate, it's very clear that you reach a point where once government spending goes over 15 to 20% of the total output of the economy falls. And it's statistically significant over the last 75 years across 100 countries and so on. It's just mathematically proven. The more that these governments spend, and the more that they borrow, the worse their economy does. And so that combats kind of the theory, because it's how doesn't it?
Well, it's not correct. And
it's statistic. I mean, it's been proven. 99%.
It's not, Stephen. And if you're talking about Reinhardt and Rogoff,
no, I'm not talking about that.
Okay.
No.
Look,
I think they're wrong. But
just look back at the last 5 years. Who was the fastest growing? Which is the fastest growing economy in the G7 by far? Everybody else was way in the rearview mirror. Who's the fastest growing economy in the G7? The United States of America. Who had the most rapid increases in the deficit? You hear people say all the time today, I heard it on television this morning, why are we running, Powell said it, why are we running deficits of 6% of GDP when we're at full employment? Stop and think about that. Why have we had unemployment at about 4% for the better part of the last 3.5 years? Maybe it's because the deficit has been there to provide enough support for the economy to grow as rapidly as it has. Real GDP.
How do you explain that?
We are so much faster. Unemployment is lower and our deficits are bigger. It's the answer to the question.
So over the last 100 years, over 120 countries, that it's 99%, proven correct, that the more that government spends and borrows, the worse their economy does. I mean, that's just what the studies show, and it's been duplicated many, many times. Now, that's not to say you should have no government. I'm not saying we shouldn't have government. It's just that our government's way, way, way too big right now. And that what you do when you have your government that's too big is you're basically taking resources away from the productive private sector and you're giving it to an unproductive government sector. That's why what Elon Musk is doing is so important. He's explaining to the American people how incredibly inefficient. You mentioned education. Let's take that as an example. Everyone wants a great education system. We're all worried about our miserable condition of our schools. We have spent $2 trillion in the last 30 years at the federal level on the U.S. Department of Education. $2 trillion. And guess what's happened to school test scores over that period? Down, 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 down. Show me how in the world has that $2 trillion led to any productive output?
Oh, we need to do a better job of
Yeah.
getting performance
We
up
do.
in our
Yeah,
schools.
I agree.
But you'll hear President Trump compare the amount of money per capita that we spend on education here in the US. And then he'll point to some Scandinavian country, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and he'll say they spend a whole lot less on their K through 12 education and they get better outcomes. Yeah, they also have maternity and paternity care, where the parents get to stay home for the better part of a year with a child in those early years. They have free child care or nearly free child care so that when kids are growing up to the age of 3, by the time they start kindergarten in these other countries, they're already reading at a 3rd grade level. So it's no wonder that by the time they get
Well,
to
then,
high school, the
okay, so then
performance
how
is
do you
very
explain
different.
the fact that in the 50 largest cities in the United States where our schools are miserable, the Catholic schools spend half half the amount per student as the government schools do, and the Catholic schools have much, much better performance. In other words, that's not explained by the fact childcare or anything like that. It's just the Catholic
It
schools
probably
are much
is.
more productive.
It probably is.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't resolve
Yeah.
the issue because I don't have enough of the data, but I would be very interested in the amount of time and investment that is spent at a pre
Yeah.
K through 12 education.
I'm just making
those
this as
families.
all I'm trying to do is use this as an example of the fact that government spends things very inefficiently, including the Pentagon and so on, and we could free up at least $1 trillion of resources. When money is wasted, this is one thing I don't understand. I'm more of a Republican, you're more of a Democrat. Why are Democrats opposed to what Elon Musk is doing? He's telling us where the money is being wasted, and people are spray painting Tesla cars because he's exposing the fact that these programs aren't working.
No, he's not. He's not really, Steve.
Yes.
If there was even remotely the amount of waste or fraud, let's do fraud in the system that he is claiming there is, his numbers would be off the charts.
Yeah.
He's captured almost nothing. And he's touted $1 trillion or $2 trillion, and he's turning in 50 million here, 1 million there. It's not there. It turns out that the government actually does a pretty darn good job running programs efficiently.
What
Is
am I
there
making?
some waste? Is
Wait,
there fraud?
this
Yes.
isn't-
Should we get rid of
Stephanie,
it?
this
Absolutely.
isn't even, I'm not talking about Elon Musk now. This is the U.S.
That's your
General.
question.
Okay, I'm going to, the U.S. General Accounting Office, which is the U.S.
There you
government
go.
auditor, says that $150 billion was stolen from Medicaid. $150 billion. And nobody in Washington, it would be like if I went up with a gun to you and took money out of your pocket, and nobody wants to do anything about the massive waste. The fact that the USAID and these foreign aid programs, they can't even tell us what happened to the money.
USAID.
All right, hey, I'm gonna let you
rounding error.
respond, Stephanie, and then we're
Isn't
gonna go to
even-
the
So
audience
it's just not,
questions.
it's not efficient
All right.
spending.
USAID isn't even a rounding error in the federal budget. If you want to talk about a part of the federal budget where there's some real money, it's the Pentagon.
I
which
agree.
hasn't passed a budget.
I agree.
Hasn't passed an audit in
I
7
agree with you.
So let's go. The GAO is there to do
Yeah.
this job. I don't know why we thought we needed to duplicate. It's not very efficient.
Because
when you
nobody
already have
does
the government-
anything in Washington. You were on Capitol Hill. Why have we allowed this to happen for the last 30 years? I mean, it's disgraceful that we allow money to be stolen from taxpayers and nobody does anything. That's criminal.
All right, we're gonna move to the audience questions, but I'm hearing that we have at least 3 things we all agree on here. These guys, defense, waste, fraud, and abuse, lower interest rates, and some tax cuts. Now I'm going to move to the audience. And again, if you want to put your audience question in, please do that. I'm going to get to as many as I can. So let's do this as rapid fire as we can, because I want the people to know as much about your thinking as possible so they can make their decision. So we've got the first question here to Stephanie. Does the government putting money into the economy directly cause inflation? Why or why not?
No. You have to spend before there's even the potential for inflationary pressure. And then you have to spend into an economy that is supply constrained. The government sends me a $3,000 check or a $30,000 check. Let's make it a big check. And I go out and buy a car, and there's a car dealer with a bunch of inventory, and they're eager to sell that car to me at the price that's on the side of the car. That's not inflationary. If you're spending money into an economy that has reached its capacity constraints, it can't produce anymore. All the labor is fully employed, and you continue to apply additional income support at that point. You send out money, you're making payments, you're going to start bidding up prices.
Look, when the government spends money as the way it's doing right now, we have a $7 trillion budget right now. And at least, I honestly believe that we could cut $1 trillion out of the spending, and nobody in this room would even notice it's gone. Nobody would even feel it. Just by getting rid of the waste, inefficiency, duplication, the fraud, it's endemic. It's endemic. I mean, my God, I was going by, I live in the swamp. I live in Washington, D.C. Not just during COVID, but in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, nobody was working in the federal office buildings. I mean, these are people who make $180,000 a year. And you go, seriously, you go down Pennsylvania Avenue, I'd go in the Interior Department. Is anybody here? These are huge, these massive buildings, and these people are taking home paychecks. I mean, it was just ripping off taxpayers. So I'm not against government. I'm just saying we could get rid of this deficit, which I think everybody would agree would be, the more we can reduce our borrowing, the better, right? The better for our kids. And we could do it in a way that doesn't impair the important services that Americans want from their government. Do you disagree with that?
Stephen,
I mean,
I'm going to let an audience question for you, Stephen. They ask, what do you say to the idea that reducing the capital gains tax just causes the rich to hoard more wealth instead of investing?
Look, every time we've cut the capital gains tax, I mean, I'll quote, John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, who said cutting the capital gains tax is one of the most important things we can do to get capital investment in this country. You don't have growth unless you have people investing in businesses and starting businesses. And the capital gains tax is just a tax on the American dream of starting a business. Why do people start businesses? To make money. How do they make money? By the capital gain that they get out of the benefit of that. So I think that that's one of the worst taxes that we have, because it's just subtracting from the business creation in this country, and small businesses are the vitality of our economy.
Do you want to respond, Stephanie?
I mean, I'll just say that for me, businesses hire when they're swamped with customers. That's what gives them the incentive to hire more workers, to build out their productive capacity, to buy new machines, to upgrade, and so forth. It's not because you reduce a tax. If you reduce taxes in an environment where businesses aren't optimistic about the future demand for their products, you're not going to stimulate any new investment spending. But if you swamp them with customers and orders for their products, no matter whether you've changed the tax regime or not, you're going to get additional investment forthcoming, because that's how businesses invest.
Well, that's true, but it's also true that any businessman or woman, there are probably many in this room, you're interested in your after-tax rate of return on your investment. And so if you cut the tax on the rate of return, then the after-tax rate of return rises and you get more. It goes back to what I said before. If you tax something more, you get less of it. If you tax something less, you get more of it. By the way, we have a history of this, that every time we've cut the capital gains tax, really good things have happened for the economy.
Okay. Stephanie, we have a question. They say, the government produces nothing. It is only a vehicle of wealth transfer. Our government is not a board game. Do you really believe the point you're making, that the government only has to print money for our economy to boom?
That the government only has to print money for what?
For our economy to boom.
Well, I didn't say any of those things. So the question is not
Their interpretation of it.
Yeah, it's a.
Please explain to them why their interpretation's wrong.
Look, does the government, by running deficits, do only productive things directly? No, of course not. Do those deficits support the credit structure of the private sector and allow the rest of us to do productive things? Absolutely. Is some of what the federal government spends money on productive? Sure it is. Stephen, I know you like to sometimes bring up the New Deal. And I know you'll sometimes say, well, nothing kind of good came out of the New Deal. There's a website called
Nothing good came out of what?
The New Deal. The New Deal. There's a website called thelivingnewdeal.org. Check it out. Check it out. We still today, almost 100 years later, are benefiting from government spending on investment projects and so forth that were undertaken as part of the New Deal. We still have the hospitals, the post offices, the stadiums, the airports, the infrastructure. So of course, government spends on things that provide the private sector, the rest of us, with real material benefits. We're still benefiting today from those things.
All I would say is that we had the New Deal. I think one of the greatest mythologies of American history is that the New Deal was a success. It was not. When Roosevelt came into office in 1933, from 1933 to 1941, on the eve of when Pearl Harbor happened, The unemployment rate after spending massive amounts of money never went under 12%.
Let me tell you why. Can I
How
tell
in the
you
world
why?
is that a success?
Oh, I know why. Because more than 20 million Americans were employed under the New Deal, but guess what they didn't do? Count them as employed. They stayed part of the unemployed. For statistical purposes, they weren't counted as employed. 20 million people were working in the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, National Youth Administration, a whole alphabet soup of programs that were building all the things I just mentioned in the last response. Those people weren't counted as unemployed, which is why
So then why did the Great Depression last for 12 years then?
Because the downturn was so deep. It's like asking why we didn't snap out of the recession after the global financial crisis any faster, in spite of the fact that the government did a stimulus, because it was nowhere near big enough to deal with the scope of the problem that we were facing. So only when World War II came and spending got 50% of GDP did we actually get out of the Great Depression.
Yeah, by putting 20 million people in uniform. But look, the fact is, you don't have to believe me or Stephanie. Henry Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary for FDR, said in the late 1930s, we spent a boatload of money, more money than has ever been spent in American history, and it didn't work. And that was FDR's own Treasury Secretary.
It worked. It worked. It just didn't do enough to fully get us out of the Great Depression. It took even more spending to do that.
All right, let's move on. Thank you. Steve, question for you. Oh, sorry, I just lost it. This thing keeps sliding when people add. You guys are so active. I love it. It's great to have. And some of these questions I have to modulate a little bit to make them polite. Steve, here's a question for you. You say that you should borrow if the return is good enough, but who gets to decide what is worth it? What return do you get by giving everyone healthcare for free?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we do know we learn from history, right? We learn from history the things that do work and the things that don't work. Usually, although still people think the New Deal was a success. I think it was a grand failure. But I think we can make. This is why we study history, right? Is to learn the lessons from history, and we do know, as I said earlier, that if you cut taxes, good things happen for the economy. Happened in the 20s, 60s, 80s. Happened under Trump. I mean, if it hadn't been for COVID, Trump would have won a 40-state re-election landslide. I mean, the economy is absolutely booming. So in every period when we cut down, and by the way, Bill Clinton, I think, was a Democrat. I think he was a great president on the economy. We ran surplus, as you said, we ran surpluses under Bill Clinton, and we had an economic boom and a stock market boom. So how did that happen?
Steve, bubble. We had a stock market bubble.
I don't know about
the dot-com bubble.
Oh, the GDP.
See, I'm defending a Democrat.
Republican we ever had.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, here's a question for you. Is there a limit to how much the government can borrow?
That's a good question.
Doesn't fiscal capacity, the ability of government to borrow, impose constraints? What happens when lenders don't buy bonds or other government debt?
Okay. So again, go back to the two options. All right. The government's own deficit is what supplies the funds. The funds to pay taxes and buy government bonds come from spending. All right. The government runs a deficit. It is putting the money into the system. Now the money is in the system and the government says, all right, we're going to auction treasuries. We're going to sell some of these things. Who wants to buy them? All right. So people trade in their non-interest bearing dollars for this interest-bearing dollar called a U.S. government security, T-bills, notes, and bonds. We don't have to do that. This is the whole point. This is the government saying to the rest of us, we're making available to you a savings account with the federal government. It's a risk-free place to park your dollars, and we're going to pay you if you do it. We're going to give you interest if you want to do it. We don't have to do it. So the idea that you could end up in a situation where everybody says, I'll just keep my money in my checking account. I don't want the government savings account that pays interest. Fine. If we want to do that, we shouldn't force treasuries into the market. We don't have to auction a certain quantity each year. We do that. We auction a certain quantity to match the number that falls out of the budget box. If it's a $1.8 trillion deficit, we sell $1.8 trillion in treasuries. That's just by habit. That's the way we do it. We don't have to do it that way. But again,
well, what's the alternative?
The alternative is option one, which is to leave the funds in the system where the Fed will pay the interest or not. And I think we previously agreed that we're going back to a zero interest rate policy. And so that resolves that problem. We don't even need to mess around with the treasury market, or we could just sell T-bills and nothing else. Keep it at the short end. Just sell T-bills and don't sell anything of longer duration. Have a zero interest rate policy, and we've dealt with the quote unquote problem that everybody seems to think.
Here's what worries me about the size of that. And I'm not a deficit debt phobiac, but I do think we have to be really worried about, the fact that our debt now is 35 some trillion dollars, and it's turning, as Stephanie just said, it's turning over all the time, every single day. And what's happening now is you're seeing other countries, in part because of some of the mistakes I think Trump is making in terms of, these tariff wars. What happens when China, Russia, the Arabs, and so on start selling their bonds? The interest rate is going to go up on those bonds, and that's going to put an enormous hole in the deficit. Does that keep you up at night?
No, no, it doesn't. Few things do. Look, China had at one point 2 trillion in US treasuries. And people used to say, what if they start selling? And not very many years later, they had 1 trillion. And today they have 600 billion or so. Okay, did anybody notice that? Did interest rates spike in the interim as China did? No, they didn't. It doesn't matter, Steve.
Well, just today, there was an interest rate shock from sell-offs of foreign bonds.
It's not an interest rate shock because of sell-offs. In fact, Powell said he can't tell you what's pressuring yields, but I can give you a pretty decent shot. And Jerome Powell said some of what we saw in recent days was the unwinding of the so-called basis trade, hedge funds dealing with liquidity pressures and so forth, and so selling some treasuries for those reasons. But look, what's really happening is that we have chaos over the tariffs. The regime is changing.
That's true.
And nobody knows what in the world it means for inflation. And once again, markets are forward-looking, and the bond market is trying to do its level best to figure out the Fed's reaction function. Is the Fed going to have to raise rates because inflation is going to go up? And if they start believing that that's the likely path of future interest rates, you're going to see yields moving higher. I think that's
if that happens, then we're screwed, right? Because where are we going to get, then who's going to pay the taxes to pay for all these bonds?
Not the taxes, it's the keyboard. The Federal Reserve carries out those payments the same way
it's an expenditure by the federal government.
Expenditure.
The interest on the debt, and it's the second largest expenditure on our debt. So if those interest rates rise, and we, instead of paying say 4%, we're paying 6% on those bonds, we're going to see the deficit explode, and it becomes a vicious. You see what I'm saying? It becomes a vicious cycle. It gets worse and worse and worse over time.
It could, and let me just say, when Volcker was Fed chair, interest rates were double digits. Okay,
I remember.
Prime rate, I know you do. The prime rate was 21%. Interest rates were double digits at a time when Ronald Reagan almost tripled the national debt. So you had that combination of rapidly rising interest rates and a rapidly increasing public debt. Did we get hyperinflation? No, we did not.
But you know why?
Is it true that when you have a large public debt, a large stock of US treasuries, and a central bank that's aggressively raising interest rates, that it is forcing the federal government to pay out hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in additional interest income every year? You bet it is true. What is the fastest growing line item in the federal budget as we sit here today? Senator, fastest growing line item in the federal budget. It's interest. It's interest. That's right. It is interest. And who has hijacked that part of your budget? Jerome Powell and company. The Federal Reserve has hijacked.
What do you mean? I don't understand what you mean by hijack.
Well, what I mean is that campaign of aggressive rate hiking to fight inflation, taking interest rates from 0 up to 5.5%, right? And then beginning slowly to bring them back down. This turned that line item in the budget, the interest expenditure, into the fastest growing part of the federal government's budget, and Congress didn't even vote for it.
Right. Well, I think we're both in agreement, like both of you are in agreement that you don't like high interest rates from the Fed. So I want to give a shout out to our viewers from Denver. I've got a question I'm going to read from Denver. This is for Steve. Could Stephen provide more detail about how growing the economy will help and shift us away from growing the government?
I'm sorry.
Could Steve provide more detail about how growing the economy will help and shift us away from growing the government?
Well, look, the more people working, the more profits companies make, the more productivity we have in the country, the more tax revenues. So when the economy does well, tax revenues rise. It's the best way. I think that's something I would both agree on. The best way to bring down our deficit is to grow the economy very substantially. We need to do some things. Now, look, growth is a function of two major things. One is the productivity of the American workforce and American companies. And I'm really optimistic on this. I mean, we are moving into an age of robotics, artificial intelligence, which is be incredible. It's going to be incredible. I mean, the productivity, I think it's ridiculous. You know, the Republicans are talking about, we're going to bring back all these factory jobs. In 10 years, every factory is going to be, it's going to be robots that are going to be running factories, not human beings. I mean, it's incredible how quickly this revolution is coming. Get ready for it. So you don't want your kids to be in factory jobs because those jobs won't exist. Trucking jobs 20 years from now won't exist. Everything's so the productivity improvement of this is fantastic and can really grow our economy at 4 or 5%. The other thing you need is workers. You know, our problem today, frankly, is not that we have, you know, too many workers. We don't have enough workers. The biggest thing that's happening in the world today that nobody's paying attention to is a catastrophically low birth rate everywhere. Remember when people talked about a population bomb? There's no population bomb, it's a population implosion. The US has one advantage over every other country in the world. We have a demographic safety valve, and that's immigration. We can bring in young people and they want to come here if they legally, right? Legally. So I'm bullish on the US economy. I think we can grow and grow. My only point about this whole proposition is this. I think what we're doing on the debt is dangerous. And maybe it'll turn out okay, but I think as a safety valve, my point is we should, in a very judicious way, bring that debt down so we're not so vulnerable in the future.
All right. Well, now we're going to go to closing statements. We got to as many questions as we could. Thank you to everybody who put a question in. We had some great questions. And if you want to add them maybe to the YouTube channel, if you guys want to further answer any questions on our YouTube channel, this is streaming live right now. But now we're going to move to closing statements. And Steve, you get the last,
Well,
the
just
first.
take 20 seconds because that sort of was my
Yeah, that's what I thought.
closing statement. I'll simply say this, that if you look around the world and world history, it doesn't turn out too well. You know, you look at Rome and the great empires, and it is true that many of the great empires of the past were done in by runaway debt and deficits. I don't think we want to go down that path.
Thank you. That was his closing statement.
That was very sincere.
Yes.
I rest my case.
That was not a deficit of.
All right, well, I'm back up and I'm going to walk around again because I put these slides together. So by George, I'm going to use them. All right, when I worked in the United States Senate, I used to play this little game. I write about this in the book, so you might be familiar with this. I would go around and I would ask senators or their staffers, if you had a magic wand and you could wave the magic wand and eliminate the national debt, would you wave the magic wand? What do you think people said? Of course, they said yes. Every single person, no one ever said no. I don't want to eliminate the national debt. So then I would say, okay, that's an interesting answer. Let me give you a different wand. If you want to wave this wand, it will eradicate the world of treasuries. No notes, bills, bonds. The treasury market is gone. Do you want to wave that wand? What do you think they said? Nobody wanted to wave that wand. That was super interesting to me, because it was the same question asked in two different ways. They want to get rid of the debt, but keep the treasuries. The treasuries are the thing we call the national debt. Okay, so that's a very interesting. Can I please have that clicker? Thank you. So that was super interesting, right? The question before you is, should we prioritize paying down the debt to make it a priority? Not talking about growing the debt more slowly, making it a priority to pay it down. What would that involve? It would involve getting the government into surplus. That's what it would involve. So is anybody talking about that? Anybody anywhere talking about getting the government's budget into surplus? The answer is no, they're not. Stephen, this is from the Cato Institute. You might have seen it just earlier this month, out with a piece saying the Senate and the House have both just passed budget resolutions The version that passed in both chambers calls for about 5.3 trillion in tax cuts, about $500 billion, a little more, in new spending. And how much in spending cuts did the Senate call for and the House agree? Nothing. You can call it 4 billion, but 4 billion over a decade is nothing. So no one is talking about prioritizing paying down debt. This is going to increase deficits and it's going to increase the debt, and there ain't no two ways about it, okay? If we were to take seriously the proposition that we ought to be paying down the debt, what would that look like? Have we ever tried it before? The answer is yes, we have. We've done it 7 times in our nation's history. Here are the first 6 times when the government's budget moved into surplus and we started to pay down the national debt. How'd that work out for you? Well, there it is. We ended up with a depression, not a recession, a depression every single time we tried to do it. The last time we tried to do it was under the Clinton administration. The federal government's budget moved into surplus, and it was in surplus for 4 years. People thought that was a great thing. It looked fiscally responsible. But look under the hood. Look at the other side of the ledger. The government's budget moved into surplus, but where was the private sector? Deeply in deficit, spending more than its income year after year after year. That is unsustainable. These surpluses ended in 2001 with a recession. So we've been hearing alarm bells about the national debt my whole life and before. Century of alarm bells. These are from the 1930s, back when newspaper columnists thought it was so hilarious to make fun of the fact that we had 36 billion in debt. And then it grew into the 40s. And then there we are, Stephen's first year in Washington, D.C., 1984. This is a cartoon celebrating the $1.5 trillion debt. And we go into the 90s, into the 2010s, through the teens, and leading up to COVID, all the while ringing the alarm bell, making everyone afraid, showing the cartoons. Look how big this number is getting. We scare people. We tell them that they're going to burden future generations because of all this debt. Somehow inheriting trillions in wealth and savings is supposed to be a burden on future generations. We talk about default. Somehow the Federal Reserve is going to forget how to credit bank accounts. We tell stories about bond vigilantes taking over, driving up interest rates, crowding out private investment and slowing the real economy down. None of that stuff happens. This is the reality, okay? This is data from 1980 to 2020. This is 40 years of data. The red line is the national debt. The green line is the interest rate on 10-year treasuries. The debt goes up and interest rates glided down for 4 decades. It is true that in the last 5 years, since 2020, they moved together. Interest rates rose as the debt increased. Why? Because the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. That's why. So if you're looking for a bond vigilante, there it is. The Federal Reserve did that. Okay? It forced the government to pay out hundreds of billions of dollars in additional income. We can worry about the inflationary implications of that. We can have a debate over the distributional implications of that. But my goodness, this is our savings. Don't blame that bird for keeping track of our savings. Give him a pardon. Give him a pardon.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. It was spicy at times. I hope you both felt like you got to say your piece. And now we turn to the voting. And Jennifer?
Okay, have you voted in the post-state poll? They got your hands. Let's do this. What the pre-debate poll was. Once again, the resolution is, be it resolved, the U.S. federal government should make reducing the national debt a fiscal priority. In our pre-debate poll, 37% agreed with the resolution, 46% disagreed, and 17% were undecided. Where are we now? Let's see, I'm having a little trouble seeing the post-debate. Can you help me out, Carrie?
Yeah, folks are still voting, but as of right now, it's 25 agree, 65 disagree, and 10% undecided.
Okay, has everyone voted? Okay, give it just a few more seconds. I believe we had 1,500 people watching the live stream at one time or another tonight, and they were voting as well. So at least some of them were. Well, it appears to me at this point, and we will of course post the final poll on our website. It appears to me that the negative position, Stephanie Kelton, was the winner tonight. So congratulations, Stephanie. Let me just have your attention for one more minute, if you would indulge me. Once again, let's thank Carrie for moderating, and thank Stephen and Stephanie. Of course, I want to say thank you to our wonderful hosts with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. They're doing fantastic work. Support them. If you're here locally, come to their events. They do a lot of great things here on the ASU campus. I would also like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Coors Foundation, Bruce and Marcy Benson, the Arthur N. Root Foundation, and all the foundations that you saw on the screen tonight. If you enjoyed this evening's debate, I want to remind you, Steamboat Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we would appreciate your support in being able to host more of these debates on college campuses. Please go to steamboatinstitute.org to find out information about the upcoming debates. Grab one of our flyers. Go to our YouTube channel. We have hundreds of great videos on there, including all of our debates. This one will be online, probably up within the next 24 to 48 hours. Go to our YouTube channel, share it with everyone you know. And to those of you who watched online, thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. We realize there are a lot of things you could be doing with your time tonight. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us. Thanks. And if you're here in person, stick around, have some food and drink, and visit with our speakers. Thanks for coming.